They call them Generation X, or sometimes the tail end of the baby boomers. But historians and psychologists are starting to use a different, more accurate term. They call them the last free generation. If you grew up in the 1970s, your childhood existed in a unique window of time, will likely never be repeated in human history. You lived in the final decade before the digital leash was tightened, before GPS tracking, before the internet, before the world decided that children needed to be watched, monitored, and analyzed 24 hours a day. Today, we are diving deep into the psychology of the 1970s. We aren't just looking at the toys, the wood-paneled station wagons, or the bell-bottoms. We are looking at the mindset. How did latchkey parenting, dangerous playgrounds, and total analog freedom wire the brains of a generation? And why do those who lived through it feel a profound sense of loss for a world that allowed them to be simply invisible? To understand the psychology of the 70s kid, you first have to understand the concept of the invisible child. In the modern world, a child is a data point. They are tracked by school portals, smartwatches, and constant text messages. Parents know where their children are, who they are with, and often what their heart rate is at any given moment. In 1975, however, once you walked out your front door, you ceased to exist on the radar of authority. You were gone. There was no way to reach you. If plans changed, too bad. If you got hurt, you figured it out. If you were hungry, you found a garden hose. Psychologists call this unsupervised autonomy. For the 1970s child, this wasn't a philosophical choice. It was the default setting of society. The rule was simple, universal, and non-negotiable. Be home when the streetlights come on. Think about the sheer amount of trust that required. Parents in the 70s weren't negligent. They just operated on a completely different psychological baseline. They believed that the world was generally navigable by a 10-year-old. This created a generation that is fiercely independent, often to a fault. When you are 8 years old and you are 3 miles from home with a flat tire on your Schwinn Stingray and no quarter for a payphone, you don't have a safety net. You have a problem, and you have to solve it. This built a cognitive resilience that is impossible to teach in a classroom. It taught you that panic was useless and action was mandatory. Then, there is the term that defined the decade, the latchkey kid. The 1970s saw a massive tectonic shift in the American family structure. Divorce rates spiked to historic highs. Inflation was hitting hard. Stagflation was the economic monster of the decade, eating away at paychecks. For the first time in American history, it became common for both parents to work full-time just to keep the lights on. The result was millions of children coming home to empty houses at 3 p.m. Psychologically, this solitude did something fascinating. It forced children to become mini adults. You had chores. You had to start dinner. You had to entertain yourself without an algorithm feeding you content. There is a distinct, melancholic comfort many 70s kids recall about that time. The silence of the house in the late afternoon. The ticking of the kitchen clock. The freedom to watch soap operas like General Hospital or Dark Shadows, or to raid the liquor cabinet if you were daring enough. It created a comfort with solitude that is rare today. The last free generation doesn't fear being alone. They were raised in it. They learned to decompress without external validation. But let's talk about safety, or rather, the lack of it. If you look at a playground from 1973 today, it looks less like a recreational area and more like a lawsuit waiting to happen. We had metal slides that reached temperatures hot enough to second-degree burn the back of your legs. We had jungle gyms built on unforgiving concrete slabs. We had merry-go-rounds that spun fast enough to generate G-force. We had chemistry sets with actual dangerous chemicals and wood-burning kits that were essentially soldering irons, sold to fourth graders without a second thought. And let's not forget the quintessential 70s experience, riding in the bed of a pickup truck. No seatbelts, no roll bars, just you, sliding around on the ribbed metal floor of a Ford F-100 while your dad did 55 down a country road, the wind whipping your hair into a frenzy. Modern psychology emphasizes safetyism, the idea that removing all risk is beneficial for development. The 70s psychology was the opposite. It was about managed risk. Pain was a teacher. You touched the stove, you learned. You fell off the monkey bars, you learned gravity is undefeated. By sterilizing the environment, we may have protected bodies, but the 1970s environment protected the spirit. It taught you that you could get hurt, bleed, cry, and then get up. The world didn't stop because you got a bruise. There is another factor of the 1970s that is almost extinct today. True, unadulterated boredom. In 1976, if it was raining and there was nothing on the 3 TV channels but news or golf, you were stuck. There was no scrolling, no refreshing, no on-demand entertainment. You had to sit with your own thoughts. Psychologists and neuroscientists now tell us that boredom is the incubator of creativity. Because the 70s child wasn't constantly stimulated, they had to invent. They invented games, they invented stories, they built ramps for their Evel Knievel stunt cycles out of plywood and cinder blocks. This forced creativity rewired the brain. It made the last free generation incredibly resourceful. They didn't consume content, they created context. When you look at the tech explosion of the 80s and 90s, remember, it was built by the bored kids of the 70s who learned how to tinker with radios and engines because they had nothing else to do. Socialization was different too. Today, if a child is being bullied or there is a dispute on the playground, a parent, teacher, or moderator steps in immediately. In the 1970s, the street was the moderator. If you were playing sandlot baseball and there was a dispute over whether a ball was foul or fair, you had to negotiate. You had to argue your case. You had to learn diplomacy. If you were a jerk, the other kids wouldn't play with you and you'd be isolated. This was raw social calibration. You learn to read body language, tone of voice, and intent, skills that are atrophying in an era of text-based communication. The 70s kid learned that if you talk trash, you might get punched in the nose, and that possibility kept a certain level of politeness in society that seems to be missing from social media comment sections today. We can't talk about the psychology of this era without talking about the atmosphere of the nation itself. The 1970s felt heavy. It was a decade of a massive hangover. After the optimism of the 60s, we had Watergate, which shattered trust in the presidency. We had the end of the Vietnam War, bringing home disillusioned veterans. We had the oil crisis with gas lines stretching for blocks. The children of the 70s absorbed this cynicism. They weren't sheltered from the news. They watched Walter Cronkite count the dead in Vietnam while they ate their TV dinners. This created a generation that is naturally skeptical. They don't trust institutions. They don't trust the official story. They saw the fall of Nixon. They saw the gas pumps run dry. They learned early on that the adults didn't always have the answers and that the systems in place were fragile. This is why the 70s generation is often viewed as pragmatic and cynical. They aren't pessimists exactly. They are just realists who have seen the curtain pulled back. This grit was reflected in the pop culture they consumed. The movies of the 70s weren't the polished CGI superhero fests of today. They were gritty. Jaws, Star Wars, Rocky, The Bad News Bears. Even the kids' movies had an edge to them. The Bad News Bears featured kids smoking, drinking, and cursing. It felt real. It validated the messy reality of childhood rather than polishing it into a Disney-fied ideal. And the food, that's a psychology all its own. The 1970s was the golden age of processed convenience. We didn't read labels. We didn't know what gluten was. We ate Wonder Bread, drank Tang because the astronauts drank it, and consumed massive amounts of red dye number 2. We drank water from the garden hose, which tasted like rubber and hot vinyl, and we loved it. There was no obsession with organic or macros. Food was fuel for play. You ate fast so you could get back outside. But perhaps the most profound psychological difference was the concept of time. Time moved slower in the 1970s. Without the instant gratification of the internet, you had to wait. You had to wait for your photos to be developed at the photomat, having no idea if they were good or blurry. You had to wait for your favorite song to come on the radio to record it on a cassette tape. You had to wait for Saturday morning to watch cartoons. This waiting built a capacity for delayed gratification. It made the reward sweeter. When you finally got that mail-order toy from the back of a comic book, after 6 to 8 weeks, it was an event. Today, we get everything next-day delivery. The dopamine hit is instant and fleeting. In the 70s, the anticipation was half the experience. As we moved toward the end of the decade, the shift began. The video arcades started appearing. Space Invaders in 1978. The home consoles like Atari entered the living room. The digital age was dawning. But for that one decade, from 1970 to 1979, there was a perfect storm of analog freedom. The psychology of the last free generation is complex. It is a mix of rugged individualism, deep-seated skepticism, and a high tolerance for solitude and risk. It is a generation that can fix a carburetor, navigate without a map, and handle a crisis without falling apart. But there is a cost. Many from this generation speak of a hollow feeling, a sense of emotional neglect. The latchkey life wasn't all freedom. Sometimes it was just lonely. The lack of supervision meant that when bad things happened, you often dealt with them alone. Trauma wasn't processed with a therapist. It was buried under the carpet of the den. Yet, despite the scars, or perhaps because of them, there is a fierce pride in having survived the 1970s. It was the last time American childhood was wild. It was the last time the world felt vast and mysterious. If you are from this generation, you know the feeling of the streetlights flickering on. You know the feeling of the cool evening air after a hot summer day on the asphalt. You know the feeling of total, terrifying, exhilarating freedom. And you know that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, no app will ever replicate the feeling of riding your bike with no hands, down a hill, with no one watching and the whole world in front of you. That is the legacy of the last free generation, a psychological imprint of a time when we were less connected, but perhaps more alive.